Welcome to the climate change session. Thanks for joining us. It's been a roller coaster year on the climate front. We went from the landmark Paris Agreement, when the world's governments finally found a formula for collective action to address the threat of climate change, to Trump's recent withdrawal of that agreement after a lot of pressure on the other side from businesses, investors, the public, to the issuance of the statement, "We are still in," which was signed by over 1,000 cities, states, businesses, universities, and investors, including many people in this room and ICCR. In the spring of 2016, investors, the public, and communities across the country hailed EPA's robust methane regulation for new and modified infrastructure. We worked very hard on that, and the results were much better than anyone had expected. So the investor voice was really significant there. And the Pruitt EPA is rolling that back. I think not without some court challenges, but we've been facing a lot of, as I said, it's been a roller coaster. The Clean Power Plan is another area where this administration is rolling back important climate policy. I should say that in the same way that the states and cities have been, a lot of the locus of action has shifted to the local level, that's also happened with our methane work. So a group of us have been engaging in Pennsylvania with the companies that are active there and with state legislators, because the governor is interested in passing regulation on existing infrastructure. They already have it on new and modified. And we're trying to keep the window for that open. Despite the current administration and the wave of anti-regulatory actions and movement in the country, there's still opportunities for us to act on that in that area, and we're very busy on that. So let me know if take a risk and turn off the mic. And believe in this small device here. So the world has moved on, though, toward clean energy, with or without Trump and those who would take us back to a reliance on fossil fuels. The rapid support for the "We Are Still In" statement shows that, with new coordination from networks that had not previously worked together, which I think is really significant. So, despite all the negatives, there are a lot of really good things coming out of this moment. And as you heard earlier, for the first time, big investment houses voted with us on climate resolutions at ExxonMobil and Occidental. And investors generally showed concern this season with high votes and a raft of successful withdrawals. I'm not going to ask Mary to put my Excel spreadsheet up, but it's available on the website. It's all color-coded, and you can see at a glance lots of high votes. I mean, really astonishing. We used to think if we hit 20 in the 20s percentile, we were doing really well. And now the 2-degree scenario proposals were all up in the 40 percentiles. There were 33 proposals in the climate space successfully withdrawn, which meant we got the agreement with the companies. The 2 got majority votes. 14 got votes in the 40 to 50% range, 12 got votes in the 30 to 40% range, and 10 were in the 20 to 30, and only 8 got votes under 20%. Wow. And that was across, all the climate proposals, including the climate lobbying and political spending proposals that Tim was talking about earlier. I won't go into too much of the detail there because we've already talked about it, but I think some of the, let me get my computer to work here, some significant takeaways from the season. The science-based targets resolutions, when we file those, we often are the first ones out on something, and we weren't, people weren't sure they were going to make it through past the SEC. Not only did they make it onto the ballot, onto the proxy, but several achieved votes in the 30 percentile range, and several were successfully withdrawn. So the takeaway there, I think, is this has set the stage for broader engagement on science-based targets by us and by larger investors, too. There's a big initiative underway that with CalPERS and international investors on science-based targets with heavy emitters, which was our campaign last year. So I'm really pleased to see that. We will be engaging chemical companies, banks, working with Lauren, who's already done amazing work in that sector, engaging 28 banks on climate risk. The airlines, U.S. Steel, other companies, utilities companies, the heavy emitters that we engaged last year. The methane proposals garnered votes mostly in the 38 to 45% range. So demonstrating the importance of this issue with investors. And there were also 6 significant withdrawals with companies agreeing to better practices in terms of methane management and greater disclosure. So really a very successful season there. And then you've already heard Tim talk about the successful withdrawals on the proxy voting proposals with BlackRock and JP Morgan. And I want to call out too the fact that they added to the momentum pushing these asset managers to vote in favor of climate-related proposals with the important majority votes. So a lot of really important and good successes in the climate space this year. And I think it will be really interesting to, I want to turn to Dr. Bierbaum here, and I will introduce her in just a minute. But I think later in the session, we can discuss directions for our work in 2018, and we will have follow-up sessions throughout the summer. I think I'll have a big, organize a big call where we can talk about strategy and see just how we want to handle this work. So, Dr. Rosina Bierbaum, I am so thrilled that you were able to join us. She has a distinguished and lengthy resume, and one to which I cannot come close to doing justice. But I'll give you a few snippets. She holds the Roy F. Weston Chair in Natural Economics at the University of Maryland and teaches also at the University of Michigan, where she's professor of natural resources and environmental policy in the School of Natural Resources and Environment, and professor of environmental health sciences in the School of Public Health, so going across areas. Dr. Bierbaum holds positions at the World Bank. She's chair of the Science and Technical Advisory Panel of the Global Environmental Facility and is a World Bank Adaptation Fellow. In fact, adaptation is her specialty. In 2010, she served as co-director of the World Development Report on Development and Climate Change. In addition, Dr. Bierbaum was a member of the Federal Advisory Committee and convening lead author of the adaptation chapter of the U.S. National Climate Assessment published in 2014. And I'm sure she'll be talking about that. She's been a board member. I pulled this out because I thought this would be interesting for our discussions about banks. She's a board member of Morgan Stanley's Institute for Sustainable Investing. It's been there since 2014. And serves on the Sustainability Advisory Panel of the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group. So, again, we're just delighted that you're able to join us here to unpack some of the complexity of climate change and the implications for our work. And I think it's really appropriate to note that among the many awards you've received, a recent one was the Sustainable Development Award for use of social media to bring climate science to a wider audience. She's great at doing this. You're known for making complex subjects.
Thank you.
And we're grateful that you're here to do that for us today, so thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I actually want to say that to many of the climate scientists out there in the world, including me, you guys are the rock stars. It's not because of your singing, but it is because... but it is because... maybe, but it is because of the work you do. And one thing you didn't mention, Christina, that you may not know, since it's really hard to put on the resume, is that I was named one of ExxonMobil's Dangerous 3 scientists in 2001. I was a dangerous climate scientist. Anyway, and so particular thanks to Father Mike and Sister Pat for all that work. too. I'm not going to talk too much about adaptation, but I did serve on President Obama's science advisory panel, 21 scientists, and one of the last reports we did for him was how to help the private sector from the federal government side think more about adaptation. And just in the 2 years since we finished that report, it turned out then that only 13% of the S&P 100 were really thinking about climate change and supply chain issues, and now it's up to 38%, and I think a lot of the work that you all have been doing is very responsible for that. So thank you so much. So I believe that a picture can be worth 1,000 words, and so I'm going to try to take you through a veritable encyclopedia in whatever time is left. And I want to start by saying I really see climate change as kind of a tale of two worlds. Either the roasted world on the right, which will be virtually uninhabitable at the end of this century in the lifetime of our children or our grandchildren, depending on what we do in terms of mitigation and adaptation, or the world on the left, which is the 2 degrees C world, the goal of the Paris Agreement. But as you know, even if the Paris Agreement is met, we're headed to a world between those two. And the one on the right, it was 8 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 4 degrees Celsius warmer than today, with the Arctic some 15 degrees warmer Fahrenheit. And so that is a very different and virtually unrecognizable world. So there are really 3 things we can do, as you know very much. We can mitigate or reduce emissions, we can adapt or cope with the changes, or we can suffer. And we're actually beginning to already do a fair amount of suffering with the about 1 degree C that we've already seen today. But there is hope that we can move to less suffering. So I want to actually do this talk in 5 parts. I recognize that a lot of you know a lot about climate, but I actually think that it's really important to be able to give a Climate 101 talk. And so I tell my students there's 10 words you have to remember, and if you can take people through those 10 words and give the story, you will present, the climate evidence. So the first is it's real. The second is it's us. The third is it's bad. The fourth is scientists agree, which is the part that is a lot of question being raised about now in the press. And the fifth and probably most important of all is there's hope. So it's real, it's us, it's bad, scientists agree, there's hope. So first let me start though because of where you start. And the first section is be very brief, but about equity. And as you know, the climate change negotiations have been proceeding in fits and starts since 1988. And it's been all about equity. And there's really many different ways you can think about the equity issue, and where you sit in the world probably determines how you come down on this. But first is if you think about what's going into the atmosphere today, here are the top emitters. And you can see, of course, now we're no longer the first, but China is. But if you're any of those countries that aren't on the map, hey, we're not really doing it, we're not really responsible. But you can also think about equity in terms of, we're missing one slide here, that's what's the problem. Okay, there was a picture of, I wonder if it is, that's too bad. Yeah. Okay, there's a wonderful picture you're not going to see. I already warned everybody that I have the worst electronic karma on the planet. Okay, so picture this. I'm showing you a circle chart, and it's showing that if you think of the atmosphere as a bathtub, a third of the water or the emissions in that bathtub are from the developed countries since 1850, and 2/3 from the developed countries. If you think of it on a per capita basis, we have overused 2/3 of our 2/3. And if you think about the 1.2 poorest people on the planet, they've put 1.2% up in that bathtub. So 1/3 from developed countries, 2/3 from the, 1/3 from developing, 2/3 from developed, and 1% from the poorest on the planet. And then and I hope this comes up later in the talk, if I were to show you impacts, one of the ones that I put together for the World Bank was to look at 13 crops and how we project they will either increase or decrease by 2030. And what you would see is that most of the poorest parts of the world are red, with crop productivity reductions on the order of up to 55%. And very few winners in that world, except for the northern parts of the northern hemisphere. And so while we might be able to grow enough food by 2030, 2050, even with that change in productivity in the poorest parts of the world, very big differences in our food distribution systems. So if you think of it as per capita, there's only 10 countries that you really care about right now. If you think, as total right now, if you think about it historic, you get a different picture. The developed world has overused. And if you look even on a per capita basis, which is what this is, and the red here are the high income bars, and the orange middle and the yellow low, even there with China, and I had a color in that bar to make it a little higher because it's gone up in recent days. Look how much lower they are than US, which unfortunately is that first red bar at 17 tons per person. So US 17 tons per person, China coming in at about 8. India, which you've heard many times in the news go, hey, we're not China, down at 4. And then look at the pathetic average for the poorest countries, the dotted line at the bottom, low-income countries well below 1. So many ways to think of equity, but clearly, and that has led into who's created the problem, who should pay for the problem, where should the emission reductions be gotten. And if you look at the solution side, you need all the possible emission reductions to do it efficiently and as inexpensively as possible. And so emission reductions can occur in those poor countries as we're putting in really efficient infrastructure. But if we don't take advantage of things that can be done in the developing countries as they develop, the costs of mitigation will double or possibly triple. And so you can see how all this is swirled around the climate treaty forever. This part is probably superfluous for some of you, but again, I think that understanding, the web of evidence, whether you think of it as a spider web or as a hammock, is important, because often in the so-called skeptics' responses, they'll try to snip a little piece in that web or that hammock, and the whole edifice doesn't fall down because of that. And so I think understanding how we know what we know, and many of the lines of evidence are really important. So I will go through this extremely quickly, but part of the deal was to put lots of references in that are hot links that you all can click and go back on. And so often my students will go, well, we've known about climate change a long time, haven't we? And so I'm always thinking, okay, yeah, like which paper should I cite? And they go, like a really long time, like since before I was born, like since 1988, which does age one. But actually, of course, as you probably know, one of the first and most compelling papers was written back in 1898 by Arrhenius, who said, hey, if you add carbon dioxide, which traps heat into the atmosphere, and you're burning all these carbon-based fuel, coal, oil, wood, gas, it's gonna heat up the atmosphere. And his calculation that a doubled CO2 world would lead to about 4 degrees C has actually really held up pretty darn well over time, even as our models have gotten much, much more sophisticated. And how do we know this? I think you probably know, but we are able to decipher past climate in a variety of ways. You see tree rings in the upper left. Those can go back up maybe in some cases to thousands of years. You see on the bottom left pollen and fossils, and you can tell what the temperatures were when things lived there, and we can figure out how long ago that was. On the bottom right, corals, which lay down rings, and one of our crown jewels in the upper right are ice cores, because the air bubbles trapped in them actually have carbon dioxide, and we can figure out how old the ice is and what the CO2 was and what the temperature is. So we can go back to almost 1 million years with a combo of these, where the ice cores take us back the furthest. But in recent times, we have just fabulous measurements. Now we're taking 50 million data points in the ocean each year, and we go down to like a mile deep, and we can stratify the temperature there. We send balloons up through the troposphere, and we can measure temperatures all the way up there. And of course we have amazing satellites too, and we have buoys that can pop up and transmit data and then go down and measure temperatures, etc. So as you all know, and I don't think you need me to take you through this in great, oh wow, our missing slide. Well, this is, see, there's, on the left, the developing countries. The developed countries, that's the overused part. That's the 1.2 billion poorest people's emission, and then damages felt mostly in green by the developing countries. And there's that map of the agricultural productivity. So by 2050, the reddest reds are a loss of 50% productivity. You see what parts of the world they're in. And again, this is across 13 crops. It's not just one. Later, I'll show you a couple things about just one. Okay, so back to the, back to the temperature record, I think. Someone already mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations World Meteorological Organization that you all use for your science-based metrics. And I chaired a number of meetings on behalf of the US for these. And I just, you know, instead of making you read the 2,000 pages, I'm trying to put the bottom line of each of them. So look in 1995, the sentence says, the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. And the scientists were really proud of this declarative sentence. But anyway, they were trying to say, it's kind of like we see a fingerprint. So that was 95, but by 2001, and I have a great story about this in case anyone wants to know, we were gaveling this down as George W. Bush was being inaugurated, literally 1 a.m. Shanghai time and 12 noon DC time. And it said most of the warming in the last 50 years is attributable to human activities. And we thought that was very powerful to bring back to the new president, who of course then walked from Kyoto within a couple months. And then by 2007, and I hope some of you hang out with scientists, we never say unequivocal, but this is a consensus statement across all the countries that are part of the IPCC. So it's 150 countries, 2,000 scientists. They gavel these things down word by word. Unequivocal, and they assigned a 90% probability. And then by the most recent one in 2013, they said it is extremely likely, raising that confidence level to 95%. So all of us who buy insurance for the, 1% chance we're going to be killed in a car crash or whatever, 95% certainty that it's happening, and it's humans, and it's real, and it's getting worse. We understand how the increasing CO2 matches the increasing temperature. So first, this is how energy use has proceeded over time, and you can see from 1850 to now, we've quadrupled our energy use. And here is biomass, which is carbon-based, coal, which is carbon-based, oil, which is carbon-based, gas. And for all our talk about nuclear and hydropower, they're actually very small slivers, and even though there's a tiny green line growing enormously fast, the renewables growing really, really fast, the world is still so heavily CO2, and of course that is changing very, very quickly. So this is just carbon dioxide, the most important gas. You all know methane is very important too. But and Christina asked me last night to just put in, while I was talking about emissions, a little bit of who the biggest emitters are. And I think you already know all this. But these top 8 account for cumulatively 20% of the emissions that are in the atmosphere, so across the world. And so very good that you're going after these top 8. And there's a group of 90 that together constitute 66% of what's up in the atmosphere. All of those, except for 7, are actually coal, oil, or gas companies, and 7 are cement companies. But your point of taking it through who uses that energy and what are they doing with it is becoming, of course, exceedingly important. And this next one may be too busy. It does say the same thing, but this actually shows you those same 8 in terms of what their annual emissions today are and how they've changed over time, and then their cumulative impact over time. So here's total world emissions. Here's all of the 90 emitters, making up that 66% of that total. And here are those top 20. So very important to go after the producers. But for example, when I showed you that first chart that said China is the highest producer today, if we ever had to pay for the embodied carbon in all the stuff that we use, which comes from China, there would be a big difference in the appearance of who's using the carbon emissions. And there was a wonderful NPR story a few years ago where a woman decided not to use anything from China all day, and she couldn't get past her toothbrush, her coffee maker, her coffee cup, and she was like, well, if I can't have clean teeth and be caffeinated, I just can't make it through the day. So it is really true, though, if you start looking at what those big emitters are making for us that we use, we would be even worse on all of the metrics that I showed you. All right, so back to the temperature record. Here's the temperature record since 1895. Here's the carbon dioxide is this blue line on the bottom, and you can see it's keeping track with the temperature record, and there, unfortunately, 2016 coming in as the best. Sometimes you'll hear complaints that, oh, look, it didn't go up every year. What was going on there? Well, if you look decade by decade, which is now what these big blue bars are, you can see that every decade is warmer than the past decade. And again, scientists not prone to terrifying comments. This is from National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. The rate of growth over the last decade is 100 to 200 times faster than when the Earth came out of the Ice Age. And so we're doing these things, this incredible push at what's the equivalent of a geologic blink of an eye instead over millennia as we used to come out of ice ages. And so to put it on that scale, now I'm showing you the ice core record, and you can see CO2 used to range from 180 to 280 to 180 to 280. This is going in and out and in and out of ice ages. And then where we were in 1950 and where we were last month. So this is astonishing, completely outside the record of the planet for 1 million years, which is what we can extend that back to. Okay, so this is, again, probably something you know, but I think this is really important if you have to give an elevator speech on climate change. So if you digested those 2,000 pages of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're basically saying, if climate theory is correct, and if it's changing, 10 things should be happening. 7 of those should be going up, and 3 of those should be going down. And so the five of the going up ones are temperature, sea surface, deep water temperature, temperature over the sea, temperature over the land, air temperature. And the other 2 that should be going up is humidity, because you're speeding up the water cycle of the planet. You're warming things. There's more evaporation. Some of it's over ocean, some of it's over land, which can make things dry. But in total, it's getting wetter. And then the last one is sea level rise, of course. And some of that is from melting land-based ice, but more of the sea level rise is from warming up the ocean. Okay, all of those are happening today, the 7 up and the 3 down. And here are the data behind those, just to show you there are multiple lines of data of more than several decades. There are the 5 going up that are temperature. There are the other 2, sea level and humidity. And there are the 3 going down, all related to ice and snow, glacial ice and snow. And so all of those are happening. So again, I'm trying to give you kind of the web of data. I know you all have heard about mountain glaciers receding all around the world, and Glacier National Park was just in the news again, although we've known for a long time that it might be the park formerly known as Glacier. This is actually the one I climbed, Grinnell, in 1997 before we went off to Kyoto. So since I painfully climbed this one, I wanted you to see that one. But you've also seen that there's a tremendous amount of ice melting in Greenland, land-based ice. So when it melts and goes in the water, it raises sea level. And there are the areas that were melting in 85, 95, 2000, and 2005, shown in orange. And of course, quite horrifically, the entire surface was melting in 2012. This was captured very well in a lot of Al Gore's movie that you probably saw, An Inconvenient Truth. And of course, the sea ice extent in the Arctic, very well known and disappearing. That's what it looked like. The minimum sea ice, which is around September, October, was that size in 1980, and it had lost an equivalent of the area of India by 2012. And you know that we've had both an ice-free east and west passage in recent years. The Greenland, so this does not add to sea level rise, but of course the dark color allows for an amplification of warming because it's not reflective white anymore, it's being absorbed. But the Greenland ice sheet, we believe, is responsible for what's been essentially a doubling in sea level rise since 1970. So it was 1.7 millimeters a year, and it's now about 3.4. And we are all watching, unhappily, what's going on in Antarctica, where Larsen C is only 8 miles from cleaving off. Now, most of that is floating too, so when that goes, it's not going to have a big impact on sea level, but the glacier behind it is no longer going to be held in place. And they're two very important pinning points. And so this could mean that we're revising sea level rise up too. But most people have now become quite comfortable in saying it will be at least 1 meter, 3 feet, possibly 2 meters, 6 feet by the end of the century, and lots of drowned cities, as you know. So all those things are happening, the 7 going up, the 3 going down in concert with climate change, but so what? As you know, we're already feeling these impacts, and there are more on the way. And again, in a very simplistic way, some of the things that most people in the street should be feeling is the earlier spring, the shifting of plants as this warming map is pushing them towards the poles or up mountains. And by one estimate, plants would have to move 75 feet a day to keep up with climate change. Well, that's not going to happen unless we have a lot of, Johnny and Jenny apple seeds out there trying to keep up. But we are seeing, for example, the center of blueberry production shifting to Canada. We're losing maples here in Michigan. Certainly extreme heat, and I'm going to come back to that several times because we're actually a rich part of the world that should be able to handle this, not true elsewhere. Drought, which has cost the U.S. on average $5 billion a year, more than double that in the last few years, of course. And a warmer, wetter world, which in the old arguments used to be a better world, is not necessarily, because a warmer, wetter world is leading to all kinds of pesky things moving north. So fire ants, kudzu, which used to be kept in bay by moisture and frost lines, now taking over lots of places. West Nile virus hitting snowmass in Aspen where they never thought it could because it was too high. We've seen what's happening with ticks. So a lot of pesky things and invasive species doing a lot better. So these databases have gotten very much stronger, even as the physical science has. So we now have 25,000 systems, biological and physical, that have been studied for more than a decade that show that species are on the move and heading north or up mountains. We have independent proof that climate is changing too, because botanical gardens all around the world measure the date of leafing out and fall. So spring is a week earlier and fall a week later. And actually, when I was in Washington, we used that as a teachable moment to change the date of the Cherry Blossom Festival, which in DC had missed, the cherry blossoms were blooming, falling off the trees, and we'd march around 2 weeks later. And because the spring was, and so we used that paper of the botanical gardens around the world proving spring was coming earlier as a reason to move the Cherry Blossom Festival up. And so we've mostly gotten it right. They've still missed a couple times too. And some weird asynchronies are happening, and this is kind of cute, but it's not really. So this is in Yellowstone National Park, and this long-tailed weasel is wearing his white winter coat because there's supposed to be snow on the ground, and he will be cryptically colored. As you can see, not going to work. So there he is, kind of exposed and out in the open. But we're seeing things like that too, where predator-prey relationships are changing. Some things that are signaled by temperature or by daylight are getting out of sync, and birds arriving earlier than the insects and all that. Okay, so the extreme heat we've seen incidences of. These are just some temperatures that were hit in recent year. 138 in Pakistan, but if you saw last year in Iran, the heat index hit, so that's a combo of humidity and temperature, not just temperature, 154. 154. So we used to say, you could be hitting physiological limits, but that is hitting physiological limits. People can't work outside, or their livestock can't be outside without some significant ability to cool and water at those temperatures. But I wanted to show you, just remember the heat wave in Europe, and this was horrible, and 70,000 people died, rich part of the world. And that is going to look like a cool summer going forward. I guess that's not the next slide, but it is coming. So drought is something that I said would also be exacerbated. You're speeding up the water cycle, drying out the interior of continents, but total water overall. We've seen the West have terrible droughts, but going forward, maybe we haven't seen anything yet. And those of you who have watched Lake Mead get to terrible levels, although there was supposed to be a big influx of water now finally last year, you can see the bathtub rings in there, very close to the bottom of the intake water. So we're expecting that there will be more droughts going forward. And we've also seen that this increase in the water cycle has led to both more total rainfall in world on average, but more extreme rainfall. And so here we are right now, but you can see extreme rainfall, the heaviest rainfalls, more than 2 inches a day, have increased 45% where we are, 74% for those of you in New England, and less in other places. But it's also coming in the spring and in the fall, so in planting season, and we've had trouble here in the Midwest planting. So I asked some of the farmers, well, how are you coping with the changing extreme rainfall? And they said, well, you're maybe only going to get 1 day to plant, so you buy the biggest, fastest, most powerful tractor you can, which is not quite the adaptation option I had in mind. Burn up a lot of gas and plant that stuff when you can. So anyway, that's one possibility. You've seen many of these floods. This is actually one of the flash floods in Europe, which cost $6 billion, that one event, and a number of you have been talking about the cost of inaction on climate change is extraordinary too. But we've been seeing this in various parts of the United States. This is Ames, Iowa, where it got 5 inches of rain in one night, and Baton Rouge got 20 inches of rain in 3 days. And we're also seeing in the hurricane cyclone activity that the largest, strongest ones have been hitting in the last few years. And so if the ocean temperatures are warmer and a hurricane or cyclone forms, there's more energy, there's more rainfall, and we've been seeing those upticks in the last couple of years as well. And of course, we've also been seeing that the average number of wildfires that are very big have been increasing, and the fire season increasing to more than 5 months. So not good news here. It's beginning to sound like the plagues. But I think it's wonderful, and if we talk about ways forward, which I hope we can get to, one of the groups that has been most active in being concerned about climate change is the insurance industry, because they really, really believe this is happening. So these are data from Munich Re, and just ignore the red band at the bottom, because those are geologic events like earthquakes, so they're not weather related. But everything else there is, so green are meteorological events, blue are hydrological events, and orange are climatological events. But if you look, the total global number hovered around 400 in the 80s, 600 in the 90s, and 900 in the last decade, and there were 1,000 of these events a year. Yes, some of it's because people are living where they shouldn't live, but not all of it. And where were these things distributed? Again, ignore red as I go to this next slide. So everywhere, and the US is not immune. So we're seeing blue, yellow, and green everywhere. So these are impacts today. Some of these extreme events are so extreme, I mentioned 154 degrees in Iran, heat index, that scientists are beginning to get to that kind of attribution level. You know how we used to have to say, you can't link any one event to climate change. But some of the heat events, and some now possibly the drought events, are so out of the possibility of normal that they are being attributed to climate change. And so this is showing you, if you believed that a summer should be a third cooler than average, a third on average, the average temperature, and a third warmer than average, which is what the blue, white, and red show, this is what temperatures in the northern hemisphere on average look like from 1950 to 80. By 90, they'd shifted to the right. By 2000 to 10, 2001 to 2010, they'd shifted. And so now, for those of you who've taken any statistics, you know, 3 standard deviations is really, really rare. But with this shifting in the temperature regimes across the globe, we are now getting events that would have been 1 in a million events, more than they ever should occur. And so in the United States alone, we had 5 1,000-year floods last year. So this extremely improbable under an unchanged climate suddenly can be attributed to climate change. And so now you see those extremely hot summers were 1/10 of the area, they're now 20%. So what's the future portend? You all know what we're trying to do. Stop at 2 degrees. We're very likely almost baked in with the emissions that are up there today to something awfully close to 2. With the Paris agreements, we're more like between 3 and 4. And these are just some of the impacts where the orange color gets really worrisome that will occur. So that you can see at 2 degrees, we already have some problems with food. We definitely have problems with water, probably another billion people short of water. Very extensive damage to coral reefs, and this has, of course, been in the news quite a bit. But as you move to 3 and 4 degrees, you can see problems in virtually every sector and every country. This is a chart that I show to my students, but I think if you think about your children or grandchildren, it would be equally relevant to you. So a child that was born between 1980 and 2010 in the top left, compared to when they're in their dotage in 2080, this is showing the number of days where the temperatures will be over 95 degrees. And so you see there's not much red there. There's more red by the time they're graduating from college. There's more red by the time they're having their children. But you can see an awful lot of the US is experiencing, especially in Texas, more than 200 out of 365 days a year over 95. But in other parts of the country, a very significant change. We're seeing a lot of this attribution of heat events and concern about future heat events in the scientific literature. Again, one of the strongest links to climate change that we can make now. And I had promised I was going to show you this. So if you remember that Europe summer where 70,000 people died, here's how anomalous that temperature was back then. But going forward, it'll be an average year in 2040. And by 2060, that temperature summer would be a very cool year. So just to give you some sense of how big the changes in store are. And for crop yields, now this is just looking at one. The map I showed you was for 13 crops. But if you talk about corn, for these 3 lines that are reducing between 20 and 40%, the orange line is Africa maize. The light purple line is India maize, and the red line is US maize, corn maize. And so again, going forward in time, with the changing heat and temperature, the hotter summers, the temperature of corn tasseling time, potential problems with production of food in all parts of the world, not just the United States. And I just read an article yesterday that said the average time to develop a new corn crop is about 30 years. And so if we're and that's corn where we actually put a lot of money into research. There are some other crops like cassava we don't really put a lot of money into. So if we really want to have cultivars ready for the time that we have the 2-degree temperature, 3-degree temperature, we really need to be spending R&D money on that now, not a hot topic in the current 2018 budget, unfortunately. And I promised I would show you what would happen to drought. This is expected drought that lasts more than 3 months right now. So there might, the worrisome are always the yellow, orange, and red. Not too worrisome now. Lots of yellow, orange, and red as you go forward to the last quarter of the century. And Christina had asked me to just pull out some regions. And the reason I put this figure up is because I actually think you all might be interested in looking at this reference. So the World Bank did 3 reports called Turn Down the Heat and then colon, and there were 3 different subtitles, on the 6 parts of the world that are in the 9 parts of the world that it works on, and what might happen there. And that's when they came up with, we might be hitting physiological limits, which got people very concerned. But anyway, what this chart is showing on the right is what's at risk. But what it's showing on the left is that when the temperature has increased 1.5 degrees C, which is like any day now, 25% of their land area will be beyond the highest normal heat. So by the time you hit 3 degrees, 70% of Africa's land area, and if we hit 4 degrees, 85%. So a lot of interesting information by region, and I'm really actually very glad that the World Bank has considered climate change to be part of its mission. I think many of you probably also know that Bloomberg, Paulson, and Steyer did this report, Risky Business, and I think it's very helpful to have someone in that part of the world say that the US has a whole lot to risk from sea level rise, 66 billion to 106 by 2050 below sea level. That's just not storm surge, that's below sea level. And of course, that number could be extraordinary. The second report that they put out, which I'm reasonably certain is not the next slide, actually said that the US could meet what Obama's goal for 2050 was in terms of emissions. They did a calculation of could the US get to 80% below its 2005 emissions, and they concluded yes. So that report was dropped on the street even as Obama's was, unfortunately, after the election. But that 1 meter of sea level rise would take out 9 million people in, here's Vietnam, and it'd be more than that in Bangladesh. And so as we think of this as all about equity and environmental justice, climate change is probably the biggest environmental injustice of all because it is going to affect the poorest of the world most. And there are many, many coastal cities that are vulnerable to sea level rise. We think we've seen a lot of refugees now. This is likely to be an increasing problem. And then there are a number of tipping points. And I tend to think that the tipping point analogy in general is overused. But these are just some of the things that could happen. So in the Amazon there, you see the potential for massive forest dieback. If Greenland and Antarctica melt, that's going to be a really big deal for sea level, and once it starts, it may be uncontrollable, and it may actually affect the normal circulation pattern in the ocean. And there was just an article Christina sent me from the Washington Post about how if a big influx of fresh water, say from Greenland, went into the North Atlantic and stopped the thermohaline pump, it affects weather all around the world, and it would cause incredible drought. And so we used to think that was impossible, but these things are tipping points we can't ignore, and some would be essentially reversible, such as rainforest shifting to savanna or desert. And we've already mentioned the problem with coral reefs, and of course the Great Barrier Reef is one that we're watching very nervously now. And of course the CO2 is going in the atmosphere, the red part. A lot of it, though, is being absorbed, the green part, by the ocean, but that is becoming CO2, and water is weak carbonic acid, and that's making the ocean get more acidic. And so we are seeing, and there was just another paper I saw last night when I got home, Christina, that there are pockets of very acidic water off the west coast that oyster farming is going to really have problems with. And so we've seen that some of the krill, which depend on shell formation, are having trouble and will have trouble going forward. But of course, this is the base of the entire food chain of the ocean. And you think plants need to move 75 feet a day, and that isn't going to happen. Fish actually can. And so we are seeing all sorts of tropical species heading north and pushing out kind of normal ecosystems. And so we may have to, you're not going to have any cod in Cape Cod anymore. We'll have to come up with a new name for that one too. And then oh yes, and here's I did put this one in. This is the problem with me starting this at midnight when I got home last night. Yeah, and so worrying about Greenland melting and then actually things growing on Greenland that might be dark colored, that might help absorb heat, that might make it melt more, or the amazing Larsen B ice shelf that I mentioned. And then not least, we also need to worry about fragility hotspots. And these are places where you can overlay the worry of disaster, incredible poverty, and climate change vulnerability. And of course, look at where those parts of the world are as well. So what of this is avoidable? Okay, let's say this is the range, the blue bar is the range of Paris emission reductions, the 2-degree bar. And on the right, you have a bunch of different IPCC scenarios, but obviously we want this green one. And here's been the temperature profile just now in the last 20,000 years. since the last ice age. So if we stopped at 2 degrees, we could avoid these tipping points: the West Antarctic ice sheet, Greenland, the Arctic summer sea ice being completely gone, save some alpine glaciers, and save some coral reefs. No, these are still at risk. Excuse me, I'm going backwards here. So 2 degrees does not guarantee that these 4 will not be hit, because you see they are inside the bar of the Paris range. We would avoid probably these. So 2 degrees is no picnic, which is something I think we all know from the push to try to get to 1.5. On the other hand, we're essentially locked into 2 now. And the way to get back to 1.5, a century or more, would be quite a bit past this. So whether the climate agreement, and you all know how happy they were, how wonderful it was. Kerry took his young granddaughter as a sign. You know when it went into effect. And who has ratified, and I thank you, Christina, because last night I realized 7 more countries ratified since my May slide on this. So we're up to 195 parties signing it, 148 ratifying. We're still in there as ratifying, as you know. And I think it's really important that even if Paris achieves it, it's something that goes out to 2030. And the great momentum of turning climate around is going to take a really long time. So the nationally determined commitments only go till 2030, and the answer our children are going to have to really deal with is the next 70 years. And so there are a lot of scenarios that people have done. If you stay on Paris, you're about there. If you really, really increase ambition every 5 years, as we hope, you can possibly be in that 2-degree range. This is a list of the things that I thought was particularly good about Paris, that you said what you were willing to do, you had to ramp up every 5 years. The rules for transparency, yet to be determined, are coming. Mission innovation, which I saw Christina sent you as a link, very exciting, showing that 22 countries in the EU are going to double renewable and clean energy investing over the next several years, and public and private sector is joining. The intent for 100 billion in mitigation and adaptation, and with the Green Climate Fund X'd out by the US, I think this is an area that we all need to be very conscious of bringing back in. The Compact of Mayors, 1,000 companies that were mentioned, the Paris Pledge for Action, where anybody could sign up for whatever. And so I think that we actually have reached, finally, a tipping point in the private sector and the public sector for climate change being something. And so, I would just want to end with a couple of hopeful thoughts. I think the drumbeat of science is getting stronger and really is very hard to ignore. People are feeling the impacts already in their place. New voices like you, not that you're new, but climate is relatively new to you. The cost of renewables truly, truly are plummeting. Cities, states, and countries are taking actions. Businesses are responding. The investors are taking actions. We're seeing lots of vital activity on campuses. Students are finally out demonstrating again. And I was really, being a child of the 70s, but I mean, I'm really heartened because some of my students have come in and said, I'm going to run for office. I mean, we need, yeah. And much as it pains me to say it, I think that last bullet is not irrelevant. The US is just not that important anymore. I mean, you know that public opinion, all more than 60% wherever where we live, the new messengers, and I wouldn't underestimate taking an entity like the World Bank to say climate change means if I cannot achieve my mission of alleviating poverty if I don't tackle climate change. You all know the Dalai Lama and the Pope, and you all know that in Paris, 154 religious leaders made statements, very, very powerful. Of course, you guys know what you do. The faith-based community is really powerful. And I hope you all know about these 21 kids who are suing the federal government. I think this is going to be really interesting. There are a couple of documentaries being made about them. They're growing up during the 3 years that this is happening. They spoke at Science Day in DC. Extremely moving. Their day in court is in July, unless the Justice Department pulls some really fancy trick. And I think, it is, and the Pope has written an amicus brief, so it's, well, So it was ExxonMobil and Trump against the kids and God. So we really hope. And I'm really, just on my last 3 slides, I mean, renewables have surpassed coal back in 2015 as the largest new source of global capacity. It's not completed in generation form, but they're 71 cities, and you know that represents 600 million people, form climate coalition. The low business, the business backs low carbon. Again, that letter to President Trump, that was the full page ad, even though it didn't do anything. And you know, again, I was pretty excited that Morgan Stanley signed on to that, since Mindy Luber and I are both on that board. And again, if you don't know about this, please pay attention to this one. This is the Bipartisan Climate Solution Caucus. So in order to join, you have to come as a Democrat with a Republican, or a Republican with the Democrat. So it's kind of the Noahs Ark idea, pair by pair. And they are 40 strong now. And I think I put a list, I'm afraid to tell you what's coming next. Yes, I put a list of them. Unfortunately, Midwest seems woefully unpresent. There is a Wisconsin and Illinois there. But you know, I've been hearing, actually Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island said to me, you know, we're all here, we're all fighting. If there's all these corporations that want to do good stuff, please have them come and talk to us. We need to hear that the corporations think that this is good business. And so they feel they're not getting enough hill visits from the companies that are all excited about being green. And of course, you all know that many of 50 countries have promised to go 100% renewable. And this is just 83 that I know about that promise to be 100% renewable. And so just to say, this is the first time I think we had the potential to be a generation to leave the next a truly intractable problem, which absolutely cannot be our legacy. And so I hope that you continue the great work you're doing. Thank you so much for it. And to me, you are rock stars.